In this lesson, we're going to be learning about some complexities of genetics, especially those that we see in humans. So you may have known that dimples, freckles, and the shape of your earlobe are all things that are inherited. These are traits passed along from parents to offspring. But there are some other things that we can talk about where the human genetics are a little more complicated. So in humans, oftentimes we see that genetics is more complicated than just saying dominant and recessive. One example is skin color. We don't have 2 skin colors or 3 skin colors. We have a whole broad range of skin colors, and that is controlled by a number of different genes all interacting with one another. The first complex gene I wanted to talk about are those traits that are what are called sex-linked. These are traits that are determined by genes on the sex chromosomes. If you remember, we talked about the sex chromosomes, and that is chromosome number 23. In females, it's XX, and males, it's XY. If genes are determined by, if there are genes on the X chromosome, we're going to see a different pattern of inheritance because males and females are different. These traits tend to be more common in males than females, and sons will inherit these traits from their mothers. Daughters inherit from their fathers, inherit the gene. 2 examples are colorblindness and hemophilia. So hemophilia is a disorder in which individuals cannot properly form a blood clot. So this is what that looks like. When you have an injury, you'll be bleeding, and then along will come some platelets, and there are some chemicals involved, some proteins that are involved in forming the clot. If you have hemophilia, your blood cannot clot, and this is inherited. It's a genetic disease that's inherited by a gene that's found on the X chromosome, so it's a sex-linked gene. Likewise, some forms of color blindness are inherited. Hopefully you can see what number this is. If you can't, you might be colorblind. And this is, again, something that the gene is found on the X chromosome, which means that the pattern of inheritance is different for males and females. And it's actually much more common for males to be colorblind than for females. Another different type of complex genetics has to do with what's called incomplete dominance. In incomplete dominance, one allele is not completely dominant over the other. So rather than having a recessive gene or allele that disappears, instead, a heterozygous person will show a blending of traits. An example of this is hair texture. So we have what we might think of as the dominant, but it's not really dominant. We have 2 dominants. We have curly and straight, and then if you combine them in the heterozygous, you actually have kind of wavy hair. So that's an inheritance with incomplete dominance. We also have something called codominance that complicates genetics. For some traits, if an allele is present, you see both of them. There's really no dominant. So it's similar to codominance, but not exactly the blending of the traits. Instead, you show both traits at the same time. An example of this is blood type in humans. In humans, you can be A type, B type, AB type, or O type. And depending on which one of these types, you can determine that you have 1 or 2 sometimes different genotypes. So if you're A type, you could be AA or A nothing. If you're B type, you can be BB or B nothing. If you're AB type, here's where incomplete dominance comes in. Or I'm sorry, codominance comes in. If you're AB type, you show both AB, and if you're O type, you show neither. So it's complicated. It's got multiple alleles that you're dealing with, and also it shows codominance. So if you look at something simple like an inheritance pattern, someone with AB blood type marries someone with an A blood type with the O allele there. These are the possibilities. You could have a child with A type, AB type. Here's another child with A type, and then here's a child with B type blood. Likewise, if you combine an A type person and a B type person, both with this O allele, you could get a child with AB blood type or a person with O type blood type. It starts to get really complicated when you look at that. The other thing to consider when you're looking at complex genetics in humans is that sometimes genes are only expressed in certain environmental conditions. So sometimes you don't even see that you have a particular gene unless the environment is right. An example of this is this disorder called PKU. This is a recessive trait that causes brain damage in babies, but babies only have brain damage if exposed to a certain amino acid called phenylalanine. So phenylalanine is found in certain foods that are shown here: meats, fish, dairy. They're in diet sodas, wheat, eggs, nuts, but they're not found in these foods. So someone who has PKU can avoid these foods and only eat these kinds of foods, and then they don't have the brain damage. So you see the gene is only seen if you eat that certain foods. Some traits are inherited through multiple genes, not just one gene interacting, like we talked about skin color earlier. So sometimes several genes will influence a trait. This is true of many human traits where we see more than one version. For example, hair color, eye color, skin color, and even height. How there's not just tall and short, of course, there's all these heights in between. Anytime you see that in humans, it's usually the result of having multiple genes. So, truthfully, this is how eye color is inherited. It's actually a little even more complicated than this, but it's not just a case of brown dominant over blue. So here we have homozygous dominant for two traits, and here we have homozygous recessive for two genes. And so we have blue and we have this dark brown color, but we can also achieve every other color in between by looking at different combinations of the two genes that are involved, this A gene and this B gene. So we can get all range of browns and we can get greens and different blues as well. Now, another thing that complicates human genetics has to do with the fact that sometimes a change in a single gene can affect many traits. So sometimes it's not just one trait, one gene. Sometimes it's one gene affecting lots of things. An example is sickle cell anemia. In sickle cell anemia, there's a change in a gene for a protein that's found in your blood called hemoglobin. When there's this change in hemoglobin, it changes the shape of your red blood cells from being round to being shaped like a half moon shape. When they're shaped that way, they can't carry oxygen the way they're supposed to. And of course, if you're not getting the proper oxygen, there are going to be many effects on the body. So just to give you an example, here's what a normal red blood cell should look like, kind of like a donut. And then a sickle red blood cell looks something like this. Here's an actual image of some blood cells. So you can see a sickle cell here, and some of these cells are normal. So in this case, having the gene for sickle cell causes your red blood cells to change shape, some of them, and this causes many effects in the body because your body's not getting proper oxygen. And so there you see some complex genetics having to do with humans. It's not as simple as just dominant and recessive.